just have the whole thing taken down because you've got one corner, one panel shaded. The downside of in parallel wiring is the size of the copper, right? And when you're working at those lower voltages, depending on the distance of your array to your charge controller, you might need bigger wire, more copper for less resistance. So the other argument on the other side on the series would be that, okay, when the sun condition's really low, when it's cloudy out, and it's raining, my voltage will still be enough to charge my batteries. Now, in order to charge your batteries, any charge controller, well, most any charge controller that is intended to buck the energy down, the input voltage from your panels needs to be higher than the battery voltage. And so if it's really, really rainy out, two panels combined in series, they can have a higher input voltage to your charge controller, and you'll still be charging. But for the most part, even yesterday in the 2 cloudy days, when it was like really overcast, I was still charging on this panel, 18 volts out. The sun angle doesn't really affect the output voltage or the sun in general, like partial shading, sun angle, cloudy weather. You're going to find that your standard panel is still going to output above battery voltage. And it's one of those trade-offs. Would you rather have partial shading when something casts a shadow, drag down the array, or do you want to try to double up your power and have, on a really crappy conditions, still be charging at like 1 amp? I'm talking really crappy situations. You'd have to be really, really bad weather for a standard 12 volt panel not be able to charge a 12 volt battery, like really bad. And it really depends on the environment you're camping. If you're out here and you've got a flat roof, nothing on it, and you're just camping in the desert all day, well, a series might, there's no real, downside against it. If you're like camping in national parks and such, and you might have a little tree, or your panels are kind of located next to a vent that you think might cast a shadow on it, well, then parallel might be better. So those are the basic differences, series versus parallel. If you're, the amount of copper, partial shading, and of course make sure your charge controller is compatible with whatever voltages you choose, right? You don't want to, I do have several customers that blown up a controller because they put too many panels in series, and they're like, how come it doesn't work anymore? I only put the 4 in series. I'm like, 150 volts, our controllers aren't designed to take that. Some are, some aren't. Any questions or comments on the great debate? Huh? Okay, yes sir.
Yeah, somewhat related, but some RV manufacturers, when they pre-wire controllers, they use 10 gauge wire. You read a lot of controversy if that's large enough or not.
Okay, and like a good question. It's like, okay, if I do decide to go in parallel or in series, whatever my voltage is, how do I know what gauge wire should I utilize? Now, as a rule of thumb, you want to try to keep your voltage drop or your resistance under 3%. That's just a rule of thumb. Of course, the less the merrier. So that depends on how many watts you're putting on the roof, and also the distance between the charge controller and the panels themselves, of course. And also you want to keep in realistic mind that most panels only produce about 70% of the rated output in real life, especially if they're flat mounted. If they're flat mounted this time of year, you're expecting about 50%. So when you start gauging your wire, don't keep in mind that you can derate your panel's wattage by like the 70% of its output, because there's no need to have a wire this big if you're never going to get that much output. But for example, generally speaking, you have 400 watts of solar, you got about a 15-foot run to your controller, 10 gauge is fine. If you have like 600 watts, 15-foot run, maybe 8 gauge. Just as a rule of thumb, based on my experience when I have crunched these numbers. It's not that 10 gauge is going to burn up on you, but you're going to lose some efficiency, because the voltage at the controller is going to be less than it could be. So you lose some efficiency and resistance in the wire, but it never becomes a danger. Yes, sir.
I have a controller that says it will do 12 or 24 volt batteries. I'm using it with 12, and I have a 24 volt panel. Is that thing really able to tell the difference and not try to charge my battery like it's a 24 volt?
I mean, okay, so I can speak for our controller. So we do have a couple controllers. Yes, I have a controller that's compatible with both 12 and 24 volts, and also I have a 24 volt panel, right? Now, like we've mentioned before, in order to charge your batteries, the input voltage has to be higher than the battery voltage. So your classic 24 volt battery I'm sorry, 24 volt panel will have an output voltage of about 36 volts under load, VMP. It's on a 72 cell panel. You want to stay away from using the 60 cell panels because they have an output voltage rated at about 30 volts of sun angle, panel temperature, stuff like that. You can start dragging that down in the 29s and 28s, and so your 60 cell panels may not be sufficient to charge a 24 volt panel. You know, they call those, technically call those 20 volt panels, but I've seen them called 24 volt panels. I'm always like, look at the specifications, right? Don't look at the category. So our particular controllers, when you initially connect the battery to it, if it's a 12 or 24 volt panel compatible, if it sees a voltage above 16 volts when you first connect the battery, it assumes it's a 24 volt system. If your battery voltage is less than 16 volts when you initially connect the battery, then it assumes it's a 12 volt system. And that's how our controllers decide between the two. I can't speak for everybody out there in the market. A lot of people say, well, what are the benefits of running a 24 volt system? And basically what it comes down to is your inverter. When you're taking your DC and you're turning it into AC, that conversion always takes some power, right, to make the switch. Now, if you're coming from 12 to AC, it's going to be less efficient than if you're coming from 24 volts to AC. And so you lose less power when you make that conversion. Now, most of us with inverters and such, we're not drawing a ton of power. Now, if you have a ton of solar and you're running, and you have like a commercial refrigerator that you're running on AC all the time, that's where sometimes it can be beneficial to get that higher nominal battery voltage, because the majority of the power you're drawing is going to be for that refrigeration. Refrigeration is the mother of all loads. That, microwaves, crock pots, and hair dryers. I mean, a microwave will draw 90 amps at 12 volts easily. Hair dryers are up there too. So if the majority of your power is for this big refrigerator, you're going to save a lot of power and the efficiency of your changing. And then what you would do is you would get a 24 to 12 volt converter, DC-DC converter for all your regular 12 amp loads, and buck that down for your lights and your LEDs and such like that. It's not like you'd have to replace everything in your rig to be 24 volts compatible. You would. Okay. Excellent.
Stop the bleed.
So, any questions on nominal battery voltage or anything like that? Yes, sir.
Something you just talked about, the 60 cell panels, often called 28 or 24 volt. They generally have a little bit lower performance. What's the preferred cell number on a panel?
Well, there's no, I mean, a watt's a watt, right? And I'll talk a little bit like monocrystalline versus polycrystalline panels in a moment, but a watt's a watt. So if you have, a 100 watt 60 cell panel, or it's moving like 200, right? If you have a 200 watt 60 cell panel or a 200 watt 72 cell panel, you still have 200 watts of power. So that doesn't affect the actual output. I was referring to the voltage when charging a 24 volt system. Because if you have a 24 volt system, your absorption voltage is going to be like 29 volts, 28.8 volts, right? That's pretty high up there. And in order to charge a battery, the input voltage on your panels has to be higher than your battery voltage. Now, most 60 cell panels are rated about 30 volts under load, 31 volts under load. Now, conditions, panel temperature, sun angle, dirty panels, that can easily cause that 31 volts at STC to come all the way down to like 29 volts, 28 volts. Now all of a sudden your input voltage isn't sufficient to charge a 24 volt battery. Now if you're charging a 12 volt battery, who cares? You're way above it. And if you hopefully you have an MPPT style charge controller, and it's going to do that buck type energy conversion, so you're still going to utilize all that power into your 12 volt system. That was just because he was speaking specifically about 12 versus 24. I wanted to make sure that if you decide to do that, you better take a look at your panel's output voltage. Speaking of types of panels, you've got monocrystalline, which is basically those ones that look like the squares with the little corners cut out. We see some white within the panel, and you've got polycrystalline. Those are the one with those like purple blue hue, and they look like little rectangles all over the panel. Now, 100 watt mono gives the same amount of power as 100 watt polycrystalline, right? Now you might hear that they say monocrystallines are more efficient, right? Now 100 watts, 100 watts. That's got nothing to do with efficiency. What they're talking about is the footprint. If you look at the size of a 100 watt polycrystalline panel and the size of a 100 watt monocrystalline panel, the mono is going to be smaller. It's going to be a smaller footprint. So that the efficiency of the cells is better. They get away with a smaller footprint. Now monocrystalline panels tend to do a little bit better I'm not talking this much, I'm talking a little bit better with temperature. Their temperature tends to drop less when they're hot. And polycrystalline panels tend to do a little bit better with partial shading. If you partial shade a polycrystalline panel, its voltage drop is going to be a little bit less. But these are percentage factors in like the 1s and 2s, right? These are not leaps and bounds. So if you end up having a polycrystalline panel, don't think, man, I wish I upgraded to mono. Very small potato difference. Very, very small difference in the construction. The major difference is their size, you know. But if you're in Arizona, and it's we are in Arizona again. If you're in Phoenix in the summer, and you can cook an egg on the concrete, well, perhaps, you know, a monocrystalline panel would be a little more beneficial to you in that situation. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Two quick questions. I've heard a theory that lithium batteries, which are obviously the way to go, are going to come down in price in the next year or so. Any truth to that? And secondly, if you're dumb enough, or I should say, if I'm dumb enough to buy a rig with a commercial refrigerator, is a separate inverter for the refrigerator of any benefit?
I mean, okay, first question, are lithium batteries price going to come down? I would assume they're going to come down a little, because that's the market. The more people start selling them, the more people, they have competition, and capitalism 101, it tends to drive the price down a little bit. But the cells themselves have a certain cost, the technology has a certain cost, so I wouldn't expect it to come down drastically. But yeah, the more people they have to compete with, the more I would think the price would come down. As far as having two different inverters, commercial fridge and not a commercial fridge, I would say no, because if you have, then you have two different battery banks, right? And now that you're playing this whole game, I'd rather have one battery bank than like one battery bank for this and one battery bank for that, because as I put on solar and I put on my renewable energy, I want everything to go to one. I don't want to have to be switching back and forth. You know, it's a lot easier to just go with a larger battery bank and get a DC-DC converter for your modest DC loads. But that's, of course, everybody's got their own opinion. I'm not going to say one's right and one's wrong, but I would just keep it with 24 nominal and then do a DC converter to my 12-volt bus bar, and that's how I would handle it.
What are the specs of the panel that you've got right there in front of your table?
This is just a 100-watt, 12-volt HQST panel. That's a monocrystalline. If you can see white, it's a mono. And that's, I mean, it's, I just got that on Amazon, Amazon Prime, $100, buck a watt. You know, there's a lot of good panels out there, and you don't have to spend leaps and bounds. And I get mine from Amazon because a lot of the cost of solar panels these days is the shipping. And if you're a Prime member, woo, it just shows up.
One other comment, Big Tent, Battleborn, 100 amp hours, 850.
I'm not here to sell. Does it sound like a good deal? Yeah, it sounds like a good deal. If you're getting a lithium battery for under $1,000 for 100 amp hours, that sounds like a pretty good deal. But I really haven't priced the market, and I'm not going to say one's better than the other. But that sounds like a pretty good deal. Yeah.
I think what he's saying is it's a show special.
There's a show special today. So yeah, to let you know, he was saying there's $850 for a 100 amp hour Battleborn in the tent. Yes, sir.
Yeah, question about controllers. I know that a lot of them say sine wave, but some of them are better than others at handling inductive loads like power tools and stuff like that.
Right.
How can I look at an inverter that says sine wave and tell if it's going to be able to deal well with an inductive load?
I understand. He's asking a general question about inverters, and when it comes down to, there's two types of inverters out there. You have modified sine wave, and you've got pure sine wave, right? And so as it makes the power, right, a pure sine wave is going to be very smooth, like this. And the modified sine is more choppy, boom, 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 boom. In general, you always want pure sine wave. The only thing modified sine wave is good for is like power tools, like a rotary, you know, a rotary tool, because that's just a simple motor. All your electronics are going to do better with pure sine wave, and in general, unless you're like kind of food truck and the only thing you're running is your compressor on your refrigerator, pure sine wave. You know, that's just one of those, for sure, you're not going to want that to bite you in the rump in the next.
Okay, the question I
On an installation of a single panel, 240 watt, the fuse connection at the battery, what type fuse?
Awesome. So on his question, it's asking, you know, fusing, what kind of fuse, right?
How many amps?
How many amps? So you want to rate your fuse to about 10 amps over your controller's max output. So if I have a 30 amp controller, I'm going to put a 40 amp fuse in it. Now, and that's more, especially if you're using like a DC breaker, like a Blue Seed, you know, DC breaker, you don't want to run those at their max. Now, if something tragic goes wrong, get water on your controller, wire shorts or something like that, your batteries has hundreds and hundreds of amps available, right? So really, that's there for short circuit protection. It's not going to have a hard time blowing should something drastic happen, you know, up the line from it. So it's not, I'd rather go a little bit over on my fuse size and just make sure you don't run into issues. Speaking about fuses, not all fuses are created equally. That is for sure. One of my nemesis is in product support, flexible bladed fuse holder. I'm talking wiggly wire, plastic box, wiggly wire. Now, I'm not saying they're all bad. I can say for the last 3-4 years I've been doing this job, 1 to 2 times a month, every single month for my entire career, I've had a bad fuse holder on for a customer. Not the fuse holder goes bad. I mean, they make some good ones, you know, Blue Sea makes one, Little Fuse makes one, they make some decent ones out there. But the majority of your AutoZone, Radio Shack back in the day, whatever type fuses that you get, and you think they're good, no. They fail, and they fail in a way that's really hard to tell. Sometimes it's voltage drop, sometimes it just stops working. My personal favorite, I like A and L style fuses, Alpha, November, Lima, right? You can get them, they range in quality from, you can spend $40 for a fuse and a fuse holder, or you can spend $12 for a fuse and a fuse holder. But it's a fuse that goes in and it tightens down. There's a bolt on either side of the fuse. There's nothing to wiggle loose, there's nothing to go bad. You have an eyelet terminal and a bolt. And that's my preferred style fuse. They don't go bad. They don't wiggle loose in time.
Yeah, I've got a general question about getting the output of the inverter into your RV wiring. That is a reasonable way to do it, to have some Romex, for instance, that goes right from your inverter over to your pigtail that you plug into shore power, but you'd have to be really careful to shut off your air conditioner and your water heater and get all the high draw items. Is that a reasonable solution to that?
I mean, again, I don't want to dive too far into like too much specifics on like inverters and installs, because everybody's rig is different, and I don't want to give too much. I want to give bad advice. Of course, on an inverter, if you're using an inverter, you need to have a transfer switch. You can have the same circuit of your AC circuit from your inverter shared with your shore power when you're plugged in. So some people have automatic transfer switches, and so the power is routed through their inverter so it can recognize where the power is coming from. Some people have manual switches. So I mean, if possible, I'd have you draw it out for me, and I'd answer that question after the show.
On the breaker box, you probably have different things. You shut off your converter,
Yeah.
shut off your AC, shut off your electric water heater, those things before you go plugging your pigtail into the inverter. So you'd have to have like an airplane checklist.
Kinda, you know. That's very specific. He's asking some specific questions as far as I'm not an inverter expert. You know, of course I'm an installer as well, and I'd love that, like, draw it out. I like to give good advice on that. I'm afraid I'm gonna have to see it written down because it's a little bit of pressure. I don't quite understand your concept. I understand. I think I do, but I don't want to, you know, speak, you know, such a specific situation. Happy to talk to you after. I'd love to. Okay, moving on to. Do you need a fuse on your oh, yes, ma'am.
Controller question. We're planning to put panels on our roof, a couple. But then we want to have the ability to feed a temporary portable panel.
Excellent question.
And do we need 2 controllers?
Okay, she's asking, I'm just reiterating for everybody, you know. She's asking, what if I have panels on my roof and I also want to have a remote panel? Do I need different controllers, right? There's a 2-part question to that. It's a 2-part answer. Now, obviously, if your controller's rated to 600 watts of input and you've got 300 on the roof, you could connect 300, you know, remotely, and that's not gonna bother anybody. Now, when you combine different panels, we talked a little bit before about, you know, series versus parallel. When you combine panels in parallel, you have to make sure that their output voltage on their load is ideally within 0.5 volts of each other. Just like if you shade one panel and drag down, you don't want a panel with a VMP of 19 connected to a panel with a VMP of 18, ideally, because now the 19 is going to come down to about 18. So you can match different wattage panels. They don't care on parallel. I don't care if this one's 150 and this one's 50, as long as the output voltage VMP is ideally within 0.5 volts of each other. Now, talking more about yes and no answer. Now, let's say, you know, you have panels on your roof, but the reason you have remote panels is because you want